It is a great honor and a privilege for St. Joseph University to be among the 75 universities, select universities across the country, to be hosting this lecture series.
Very good morning to you all. It gives me a great pleasure to welcome you all to the G20 University Connect, Engaging Young Mind Lecture Series. This is a platform that brings together the brightest minds from universities around the world to discuss and exchange ideas on the most pressing global challenges facing our society today. As we all know, the G20 is an international forum consisting of the world's largest economics. It is a platform for cooperation and coordination on global economic and financial crisis. The G20 recognizes the importance of investing in education and the role that universities play in shaping the future of the world. Albert Einstein once said, "We cannot solve our problem with the same thinking we used when we created them." The challenges facing our society today require innovative thinking, new perspectives, and collaborative solutions. This lecture series provides unique opportunities to bring together young minds from different disciplines and cultures to explore and develop new ideas and solutions. The Engaging Young Minds lecture series is an opportunity to bring together young minds from different disciplines and culture to discuss and explore innovative solutions to the challenges facing our society. It is an opportunity for us to learn from each other and to build bridges across borders. It is with great pleasure that I welcome our esteemed Vice Chancellor to this event today. As a leader in higher education, the Vice Chancellor has dedicated their career to shaping the future of learning and research. The root of education are bitter, but the fruit is sweet. Our Vice Chancellor, Dr. D. Gnanadurai's commitment to providing a high-quality education to our students has helped to cultivate a generation of thinkers, innovators, and leaders who are making a positive impact of the world. With a great of joy, I welcome you, sir, from the bottom of the heart. I am more than grateful to stand here and welcome the Ambassador, Sri Sanjoy Bhattacharya, former Ambassador and Secretary, Minister of External Affairs, to our event today. As a distinguished Secretary and Ambassador of External Affairs, your achievements in diplomacy and foreign affairs have been truly remarkable. As the famous quote by Henry Kissinger goes, "The task of diplomacy is to persuade others that their interest and yours are one and the same." Your efforts towards promoting peace, stability, and cooperation among nations have been an inspiration to many. Your leadership and diplomatic skill have contributed significantly to strengthening India's relation with other nations. As former Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee said, "Economic diplomacy is the fulcrum of Indian foreign policy." Your work in promoting India's interests globally, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region, has played a pivotal role in shaping India's position in the world. On behalf of St. Joseph University and all our participants, I extend a warm welcome to you and thank you for taking the time to join us today, and we look forward to your inspiring words, sir. Welcome you, sir. I'm excited to welcome you, Dr. Pankaj Vasist, to our event today. As an accomplished associate professor at the Research and Information System for Developing Countries, that is RIS, New Delhi, your contribution in the field of economics and trade have been outstanding. Your expertise in international trade, economic policy, and regional integration is widely recognized, and your research has contributed significantly to the understanding of the economic challenges facing developing countries. As the famous quote by Adam Smith goes, "The wealth of a nation is the sum of the skills and the ability of its people." Your contribution of the development of human capital through your teaching and research have been truly invaluable. We extend an affable welcome to you, sir. I feel very happy to welcome all the statutory officers of St. Joseph Universities, head of the departments, faculty members to this wonderful event. The dedication and hard work of our faculty members have been critical in promoting academic excellence, research, and innovation on our campus. Our fathers and sisters have been instrumental in providing spiritual guidance, moral support, and sense of community to our students. Your presence on our campus has helped to create a welcoming and supporting environment for all our students. We honor to have all of you here today. Your collective wisdom, experience, and insights will be highly appreciated. I extend a warm welcome to all of you for gracing this event with your wonderful presence. And investment in knowledge pays the best interest. By participating in this event, you are making an investment in your future and the future of our society. We have gathered here to share ideas, insights, and knowledge on the latest trends and developments in education and research. I am confident that today's discussion will inspire you and provide you with valuable insights that will help you achieve the goals.
I would like to brief you about the University Connect briefly. So you know that India is having the presidency of G20, and G20 is a platform where the global leaders come together, they discuss the global problems and try to find the solution. And we have many platforms like that. Earlier we used to have, still we have G7. It used to be the most prominent at one point of time because the 7 countries which are the member of this grouping, they were strong enough economically and in other aspects to decide about the direction of global change. But over the period with the rise of India and China, we have seen that the economic might as well as the might in other aspect of these 7 countries have relatively declined. So the globe is actually going through a transition where more and more developing countries are becoming important. And in that context, we have seen the prominence of G20 has improved quite significantly. Now, G20 came into existence during late 90s when Asian countries, some of the Asian countries witnessed financial crisis. So the financial crisis was contagious. It spread across the country. Its ramifications was affecting all the countries across the world. So it was realized that more coordination is required between the leading powers to tackle this problem. And in that context, first time the finance minister met, and that's how the G20 came into existence. But over the period, we have seen that the G20 and the engagement of G20 has increased quite phenomenally. And we saw that during 2008 financial crisis, how G20 platform played a very effective role in formulating a very well coordinated monetary and fiscal policy, which were very helpful to to manage the financial crisis which the world witnessed during 2008 and 9. But it was realized that finance or financial track is not the only area where the coordination is required. So over the period, G20 has grown. G20 has grown in terms of its engagement group, in terms of working group. So right now, Ambassador will tell us more about the engagement group. But right now, broadly, we have around 12, 13 engagement group, around 8 to 9 working group. And the idea of these working group is that the concerned minister or important people from the member countries come together and they discuss about the problems which are confronting the world and they try to find out the solution. Now, in that background, we also have one engagement group called as Youth 20. And though we were engaging, G20 was engaging with the youth through engagement group, but Ministry of External Affairs realized that some of the problem which world is facing right now, and I can name 2 most prominent, which one is the climate change and second is the digital transition. And these 2 problems are going to be very important and going to affect the future of the youth in a big way. So it was realized that the people who are going to be most affected by this, they should also provide the solution. So that was the thinking why the Ministry of External Affairs and RIS thought that we should engage young mind in this process. They should be updated about what is going on in the G20 track and what this process is all about, what government are thinking, And that's the way to actually inspire the young mind to take the leadership role in the G20 process. So in that context, the University Connect was conceptualized, and the idea is to have 75 lecture series in around 56 locations. So far we have covered around 31 locations. We have had 31 lecture, and these lectures are also accompanied by the different activities which students are taking. So there are quiz, there are essay writing, and there are other activities related to the G20 topic where the students are encouraged to participate in that activity and share their views. So I suppose here in this university we have seen a quiz contest and a couple of more activities related to the G20. Now, this was the whole concept of U20 Connect, which is going on quite well. And I hope the activity here has been quite interesting, and students have participated very actively. With these words, I would like to thank the Vice Chancellor and the other resource person who has made wonderful arrangement here. So now I think if we are ready with our video, we can play and then we can listen to the Ambassador, sir. Thank you.
India, home to 1.3 billion people, is a confluence of religions, traditions, and customs. A thriving global center of technology and the world's largest democracy. As one of the oldest civilizations in the world with a rich cultural heritage and diversity, and as the fifth largest economy in the world, India is proud to assume the presidency of G20. As the country blooms into a new era, we look to another poignant symbol for humanity to emerge victorious from challenges. The lotus, the national flower of India, represents our history and culture and symbolizes spirituality, fruitfulness, wealth, and knowledge. And that's the inspiration for India's G20 logo design. The design, rendered in saffron, white, green, and blue, is drawn from the national flag of India. The 7 petals in the logo signify the 7 seas and the coming together of 7 continents at G20 India 2023. Sitting above the lotus is a representation of the earth, reflecting India's pro-planet approach to life and seeing the world as one family. From this, we derive the theme for G20 India 2023, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, one earth, one family, one future.
So it's a great pleasure to be here, and I will share with you some of my thoughts on the G20 process. We will run through this in different sections, but let me first tell you that we really live in an era of transformation. I can't see the slide, so it's a little tough for me to figure out what's there. But we live in an era of transformation, and this is... That's easier. So we live in an era of transformation, which is disruptive changes across the planet. And these are changes that are primarily shaped by technology in the first place. Technology and... Is it better? Can you hear me at the end? Yeah. So technology and innovation have become the most significant disruptors. It's changing the way we live, the way we think, the way we shape our futures. The second thing that is also happening at the same time is that we are becoming a more digital society. We have much greater access to data, and we use the data for not only improving our lives, but also the way governance happens. So the way administrations or governments interact with people, the way they shape policies and implement them, and how they modify it is now becoming part of this new transformation. We are at the edge where artificial intelligence is coming into our lives in the biggest way. And make no mistake that this is again going to be a huge transformation, and it'll be a challenge and an opportunity as to how we can make use of this challenge to convert it into something that is advantageous to human society. We're also facing big changes in our societies. In most of the developed world, you will find that societies are getting older. Aging is a problem. And some of these have manifest in changes in the way the policies are run, the tax structures, because fewer people in the working group now have to look after more older people. So the way you run your tax system. It's brought about things like robotics, because you don't have enough workers. So you need robots to do the work for you. And many others. Of course, it also means migration, and people move from one country to another to do that. But at the same time, we also have some countries, like ours, which are still young. And India will continue to be a youthful country into the second half of the 21st century, which is a huge asset and a bonus for us. We also have the challenges, as was mentioned earlier, of climate change. Lovely. We have the challenges of climate change. We have the challenge of climate change, of terrorism, and we have again war in Europe. We've had war across the rest of the world for a very long time, but we now have war back in Europe. And what that has brought about is a new mindset in the developed countries, in Europe and America. And that's going to be very, very significant for us, because we can already see that there is now a new realignment that is happening. It was also mentioned that there is a shift in the economic gravity. So while the OECD countries used to be the ones where most of the production used to take place, it has now shifted to Asia. And India, China, the Asian tigers are big economic centers. And so the economic center of gravity has shifted from around the Pacific, from around the Atlantic towards the Pacific and the Indian Oceans. And what this means is that we also need new structures, because the structures that govern the world today are primarily structures that were set up at the end of the Second World War. And while they have been very useful while they were there, there is need for change so that they adapt to the realities of the 21st century. And therefore, that's how the G20 idea came about. So what I thought is I will share this in 3 segments with you today. First, I will talk to you about the story of G20. What is this G20 all about? How did it come about? You've heard a bit of it from Dr. Vashisht. We'll run through that and what the G20 can do. Then we will move to the priorities of India. As you know, India assumed the presidency of the G20 last December, and we will hold the presidency for 1 year. So what is it that India wants to do? And finally, I will say how it connects to the youth. So the G20 story, as was mentioned by Dr. Vashisht as well, really began at the end of the last century. I was very fortunate. I was posted in Tokyo in the early part of this century. And in 2008, when the Toyako summit of the G8 plus the outreach of 5 was held, I happened to be there. And there was this very significant meeting between the US President George Bush and the Indian Prime Minister of that time, Dr. Manmohan Singh, in which the George Bush comment essentially was that the G8 cannot really look after the problems of the world because the economic realities have shifted. So we need to work with India and other countries so that we have a better understanding of the true realities that infest and invade the rest of the world. And what had happened at that time was the financial issues were very, very dominant. As Dr. Vashisht also mentioned, in the late 90s, there was a very severe financial crisis. And at that time, it had already become obvious that the G8 or the G7 could not single-handedly decide what the policies for the rest of the world should be, or even for themselves, for the sake of efficiency. And therefore, the finance ministers and the governors of the central bank, for us, the Reserve Bank, would meet on a 6-monthly basis initially, and also, whenever required, to coordinate on financial and economic issues. But this was not sufficient, and so in 2008, it was decided that this needed to be upgraded to the level of a summit. In other words, the presidents and prime ministers must meet, and the first meeting or the inaugural summit of the G20 was held in Washington, D.C. in 2008 with the backdrop of the 2008 Wall Street crisis. And as was mentioned earlier as well, the focus in the early days was really on economic issues. So there was a clear movement from the G7 to the G8, where the G7 were the 7 most prosperous countries of the world at that point of time, which were the United States, Japan, Germany, UK, France, Italy, and Canada. And then they added on Russia to add on weight to that from the other bloc, and that was the G8. And for some period of time, the G8 had practiced this policy of outreach, and there were 5 countries that were selected. India and China were always there, but the other 3 were kind of rotational. They would sometimes have Mexico, Indonesia, Spain, Nigeria. It would vary a bit. But then it got formalized into the G20, which was essentially the emerging countries to add weight to what the developed countries were. And they also had with them the international institutions like the World Bank and the IMF and the United Nations to start off. Together, the profile of the G20 is rather interesting because it represents about 2/3 of the human population, the world's population. It represents about 85% of the world's GDP, or about $70 trillion. In terms of trade, about 75% of the trade in goods happens among the G20 members, and 80% of the trade in services happens among the G20 members. In other words, the G20 members amongst themselves command most of the world's economy. The other thing that was happening, and it's important to note, is that there were several multilateral processes that were on, not just through the World Bank and IMF, but also through the World Trade Organization, the WTO. And there was a crisis, if I may say, in multilateralism as well at that time. And many of these multilateral mechanisms which were being negotiated were actually at a standstill. Consequently, because multilateralism, in other words, all the 170, 80 countries could not come to a conclusion together, there were the rise of FTAs, that is bilateral agreements, or plurilateral between groups. So you would have, let us say, the 5 members of BRICS coming together to form a trade or economic agreement, or the members of the ASEAN coming together to do a similar kind of economic understanding. So because multilateralism was not working, there was a necessity to have a more broad-based approach. The G20 is structured in a very broad format, which leads up to the summit. So at the top, you have the summit in which the presidents and the prime ministers meet. It happens once a year. Initially, in the first 2 years, in 2009 and 10, there were actually 2 summits that were held in the same year. And then in 2011, after the French held the G20 summit, it was decided that it would be held on an annual basis. And the presidency then looks after the agenda. So you have the summit at the top, and then you have 2 broad tracks. One is the economic track, which is the original track, which is led by the finance ministers and the governors of the central banks. And the other one, which looks at all the development, political, and other global issues, is called the Sherpa track. So the Sherpa is basically an appointee of the head of state or government. So our prime minister has nominated a Sherpa who leads all the discussions on one track. And then you have various ministerials, working groups, and the engagement sessions. The priority for the G20 has obviously been one on economic issues, but because of the complexities of our times, more political and development issues have also come into the agenda. So the original issues were financial and economic stability, development and growth, and then we added on issues of sustainability and climate change. And we also now have many of these issues that are connected with globalization and political issues, including even peace and conflict situations. One of the important things that the G20 also tries to do is how do we secure a rule-based order? So rule-making is also an important consideration for the G20, though the G20 itself does not do the rules for itself, but it influences the rule-making in other multilateral forums. And today, in the world of globalization that we live in, where everything is, in a sense, interconnected, we also have the importance of value and supply chains, because any product or any idea has to move around from country to country, and then how do you control that process? The role of the presidency is actually very significant in the G20 system, because we do not have a permanent secretariat. And as I said, we now have an annual presidency basis, but we do have a system in which the outgoing presidency and the incoming presidency also play a supportive role in the troika, as we call it, the 3 of them. So for instance, right now we have Indonesia, which was the previous president, and us, and Brazil, which is the incoming presidency next year, or at the end of the year, who form the troika, who then collectively work together so that there is continuity in the ideas. The role of the presidency is not only to arrange the meetings and come to some sort of consensus, but also to bring up new ideas, because as I was saying right at the outset, we are in such a world of change that it is important for us to be ahead of the time, ahead of the curve, as they say, so that we can have understandings on the new initiatives that we need to bring about. We assumed the presidency at the Bali summit, which was hosted by Indonesia in December last year. And at that time itself, we had outlined some of our priorities. But it is important to know that we are today at a very, very difficult time in our civilization's history. Uncertainty is perhaps the only certainty that we have today. It's become a very unpredictable world. We've just come out of a pandemic. The COVID has ravaged the world and its economies over the last 2 to 3 years, and it has not completely gone away. And we've had conflict in the rest of the world, and now again, as I said, in Europe. We have a situation where there is an economic downturn. The rate of growth of the developed world has shrunk. And there are fears of inflation and recession at the same time, which is extremely challenging for the development, not only of the developed countries, but also of developing countries. And the war and the pandemic have led to side effects and repercussions for the energy sector, for the food, and it's led to increasing prices and significant losses of availability and supply. And therefore, we need to look at this situation more carefully. Also, we see that there is much greater polarization in the world, particularly after the war in Europe broke out. And we find that there is a tendency for new alliances to be brought up. And society is also fragmented because of these various challenges. And this makes it extremely difficult to bring about consensus, which is one of the things that we try and bring about. But what is it that we wish to do then in this difficult environment that we live in? And so we have set up 3 broad areas. The first is, this is probably a time when we bring about and renew hope, harmony, peace, and stability. In other words, we need to work for a people-oriented development process where we emphasize the role of development, democracy, and sustainability. Secondly, you've heard the slogan of one earth, one family, one future. We need to look at and hear the voice of the Global South. The Global South is the array of emerging countries, of developing countries who are becoming increasingly important in global affairs. And how does the Global South, which is going to become an important player in the future, how do we incorporate their views into the process today itself? We also want that this should be a more participative process. The very reason that we are here today is part of that this is a more participative process where every citizen now becomes a part of the process that we wish to bring about for the future. It is also more inclusive. We need to include different countries, and you will see that in our presidency, we have invited 8 countries as guests, which are also emerging economies, which are also neighbors or very close friends of ours, so that they can also contribute to the process. And we need a very action-oriented program, because very often people say, oh, these big meetings, they only have declarations at the end of it and nothing happens. So we need to focus on action, which can happen on the ground, which can bring about changes in the lives of the people. And the third priority that we had was that we could share with the world the ethos of India. And India is such a remarkable experience to go through because we have a very rich civilization. We also have a very strong and highly energetic youth population who are the makers of the future. We would also wish to share our values and principles of our civilization, our understanding of plurality and how we can bring about consensus within different groups of people, because there is a beauty in diversity. But how do we maintain that diversity and yet maintain an action-oriented program? At the end of the day, we would also like to showcase the fact that empowerment and democracy is something that has enabled our people and our citizens. The empowerment of people, particularly of women and youth, is something that we need to put even greater focus on, and we would like to take this to the rest of the world. And therefore, the final thing that we wish to also do in this is we wish to showcase that India has grown. India is no longer the India that we saw 75 years ago. And we are today a much more responsible and important member of the global community. And we assume that responsibility with humility. At the same time, we have a big role to play, and we'd like to play that role. We are willing to play that role. So when we were trying to draw out our specific priorities, because we would like to have an action-oriented program, apart from the broader issues that have been there right through the period, we, in consultation with the Troika, which is with Indonesia and Brazil, drew up 7 broad themes that we would wish to focus on. Some of this is a continuity, some of these are reshaped, and some of them are new. So the first one is an issue that has been there for a long time, which is of energy transition. And the energy, we look at it in terms of how we can shape a greener world, because energy lies at the root of development. The access and the utilization of energy is the very basic foundation block of development. And we've seen over time that as countries develop, they use more energy, whether it is electricity or energy in other forms. And this is very, very important. But we also found that the energy process utilization was very destructive, and it was leading to carbon emissions. So how do we balance these two? And that is the energy transition that we are talking about. And there are many things that we've done, but a few things that I wish to let you know, that by 2030, we would like to have 50% of our energy coming from renewable sources. And also what we would like to do is reduce the carbon intensity of our manufacturing sector to about 45% by 2030. These are big challenges, but what it does is it's going to reshape the way we manufacture, the way our societies use energy, and it's also going to bring about a new wave of energy sources and production. And as you know, in the COP process of climate change, we've already committed that by 2070, we would be net zero. We've launched an initiative called the International Solar Alliance, which is to capture solar power and to make it more useful and more reasonably priced for our people. And the International Solar Alliance today has a range of countries which are now partners, and it's an international organization that shares technology and funding for projects across the world. The second big initiative is called the LIFE Initiative, or Lifestyle for the Environment. This was launched by India. Also, this was launched in Glasgow at the COP of the climate change process last time. And we need to look at a process by which we harness our resources, particularly in terms of the way we utilize it, so that it is more in tune with the environment around us. And this also means that we need to look at more sustainable ways, more eco-friendly ways. I suppose in a place like Nagaland, you have a much more harmonious, you have a much greener neighborhood and environment. You've got a very high level of forest cover. You use many of the resources in a more responsible way. And I want to show you this example of the bamboo. And I visited a bamboo facility yesterday, and I saw how beautifully they make these products, which are sustainable, which are in line with your traditions, and which is an example to the rest of the world. So we would like to promote this life concept in a much broader way. The third broad theme was to bridge the divide, particularly the digital divide. And we have developed a number of digital public goods, and these will then provide the platform through which you can break the digital divide. Now, there are two ways in which this happens. The first is the direct benefit that it provides to individuals, because digital public goods provide you access, provide you better information. For example, the DBT, the direct benefit transfers, are now a more seamless process through which you can dole out the benefits to the people. Or the UPI, which eases the way in which financial transactions are conducted. Like today, all of you on your mobile phones can do these transactions. You can, place an order for a good, you can get it delivered to your place, It can be, you can track it and you can make the payments for it. So these are things that directly impact on the people individually. The other way is how it helps in governance. And I think things like Aadhaar is one of those because it provides a database, or the health data system, or the passport network that we have. And what these do is it helps the government in understand the needs of the people. It has mechanisms for grievance and redressal. It also helps us in formulating policies and in implementing them. So these digital public goods need to go out much further. The fourth one is of climate finance, because as you know, climate change has become an extremely important issue for our society today. And particularly as we move into the future, this is going to become even more pressing, because today already we see how climate has changed to an extent where crops are being affected. You don't know whether it's going to be summer or winter tomorrow. Sometimes the rains are so torrential that your crops are spoiled. It affects your daily life. But one of the problems that we faced in the COP process, which looks after the climate change negotiations, is that the funding and technology aspects have been very, very deficient and slow. And how do we address those? So in the last Glasgow meeting, and it was reiterated in Bali, there was a commitment that the developed countries would commit $100 billion on an annual basis for climate technology transfers and for projects which would help climate change. But very little work was done on that. So one of the priorities that we have for the India presidency is to try and bring about an action plan so that this $100 billion commitment on an annual basis is transformed into actual policies. And it brings about technology transfers and capacity building so that we can have a better climate for ourselves. The next priority was one of food security. This has become more urgent because of the combination of climate change impacting the lives in the agricultural sector and of farmers and changing patterns of demand. So what food security tries to do is, on the one hand, we need to protect the income levels of farmers and on the other hand, we also need to provide access to the consumers. So both the producer and the consumer are important. And there are many parts of the world where as you know, we still have food scarcity. India today is a net grain exporter, net food exporter. But we had a time not long ago when we were also deficit in food. So we wish to share our experience, some of our traditional practices. One of the things that has been taken up as part of the food security initiative is also to bring about the promotion of millets, which are indigenous or traditional crops that are grown in India and many other parts of the world. And in fact, 2023 is also designated as the International Year of Millet. So this is a major priority of the Indian presidency for this year for G20. The sixth priority is to democratize financial governance. You see, what has happened is that the IMF and the World Bank, which were set up after the Second World War, have done good work in terms of development exercises and stabilization of economies in different situations. But they have still been in the mindset of a developed country helping developing countries. And I think we need to change that mindset as emerging countries and economies become more significant in the decision and policy-making processes for the global governance. So what we need to do then is to bring about the voice of the South that I was saying. And we need reform of the World Bank and the IMF. And the last priority is, in terms of the themes, is of accelerating the SDGs. The SDGs were developed in consultation between all the countries of the world under the UN rubric, so that we would have a better quality of life. And that is essentially what people really look for. And the process now is how we align the overall agenda of SDG, which is the Agenda 2030, and the national plans, so that the national plans can be aligned with the overall Agenda 2030, so that at the end of the day, we have a much better world that we can live in. So how is this going to happen? And what we are planning to do is that we plan to host over 215 meetings in 56 different places across the world, actually, because some of the meetings are not in India. They're also held in other places. And they will be held in those two specific tracks, the Sherpa track and the finance track, which does the official engagements. And then we have the institutional engagements, which are like this. And we hope that through this, we will be able to bring about a better understanding. And the basis of this, again, will be through participation, inclusiveness, and sustainability. Now, I come to the last part now, which is about the role of the youth and the way ahead. And this is the most exciting part because, in a sense, this involves you. When we assumed our presidency, Prime Minister had mentioned at that point of time that we should tackle challenges by collaboration and not by conflict. This is extremely important because the world has moved in a direction where conflict is seen as a way to resolve problems, whereas collaboration, a more holistic approach, which has also been India's approach, is perhaps a more sustainable process. The second thing that Prime Minister mentioned was that technology can be used as a vector to scale up. And we should use the technology as an advantage that we have produced for ourselves, as a public good, as a social good. And we should see how we can leverage it for spreading the goods to more and more people. The third thing that he mentioned was that digital public goods extend reach. And I've already told you how digital goods are such an important element of bridging the divide, and we should then now share this. For instance, as you know, the UPI has now become, it's on an open source platform, and people can use it. We've been negotiating with a number of countries so that some of these applications are also available in different economies, and there has been great progress in this. So many more countries are now taking on some of these digital public goods that India has developed, and also to look at similar digital public goods that are evolved in other countries, because this is an experience that is happening across the world. The other thing that Prime Minister mentioned was to keep alive the interests of the Global South, because for very long, the emerging economies did not really have a voice. And the policies were decided by the rich countries, and they said, okay, this is what it is for you. But increasingly, the Global South has become more heard and visible, and we need to channelize this so that they can work for common good. And the fifth thing that Prime Minister mentioned was about how we build a trusteeship with nature. This is our connect with the environment. This is our connect with the world that is around us. So it is nature in terms of the physical nature of the trees and the animals, but it's also, in a sense, our internal self and the society and the families that we live in, and how we can make this a more peaceful and comfortable place. So that was the big emphasis that Prime Minister had put, which really we should work towards. So Dr. Vashisht had mentioned about the Youth 20, and I will just mention a few things that were also mentioned as part of that. The Youth 20 recognizes that the youth have a particular role as a stakeholder in development. And I think it's important for you to understand that and be active participants in the development process. So we have two resources today that are extremely significant but not fully utilized. One is youth, the other is women. And I think, it's the same with women as well, that women can and they should play a more significant role in our development process, our political structures, and bring about the change that is necessary for a better future. On the youth thing in particular, a lot of work in the sessions that have been going on has been focused on how you can change the way you take the future. So for instance, what kind of skill development should we look at? What is the future of work? Because our societies are changing so rapidly, and you will be leading it. So it is useful to have these discussions, not just in your own forum, but also with the rest of the G20 and its partner countries. So the future, so that the quality of life is better. How do we have better access to education and health? These are significant issues. Finally, I think what the Youth 20 does is it makes all of you ambassadors to the G20 process. And I'm so happy to learn that in St. Joseph's University, you had many events which were connected with the G20. You had, I believe, some debates and quizzes, and I'm really, really proud about that. Cultural events that link us all together, because at the end of the day, our objective is to build a better world. You are best placed in this world of transition to shape what your future will be like. So we'd like you all to be more engaged. The G20 is a wonderful way to move ahead in a manner that can influence and affect the lives of people of this world and also ourselves. So thank you very much for this opportunity. I will be very happy to take questions at the end of the session or whenever it is planned. And during the question hour, you can ask me any issues of foreign policy or anything else. Diplomacy is a great field, and I've done it for over 36 years, and it's been a terrific experience. And it's very nice for me and very, very satisfying to be with a young audience today. So if any of you wish to be a diplomat, that's a great career option. Thank you very much.
G20 G20 India intends to depict its presidency as the presidency of hope, harmony, and peace. That's what our ambassador has mentioned. India today is seen as one of the emerging economies and would substantially contribute to advance peace, stability, and shared prosperity in this fragmented world. Reading the major priorities of G20 during India's presidency, we find a paradigm shift from the concept of traditional security to human security. As most of the priorities talk about the 7 dimensions of human security. Last year, the Department of Political Science of this university conceived the idea to organize an annual human security talk in this promising young institution. And we have had that first edition of the SAID talk on the theme Health Security in Nagaland yesterday. Besides discussing on the connection of health security with 17 Sustainable Development Goals, digital health was one area highlighted by the resource person. Indeed, a theme that relates to SDGs decided by the United Nations in 2015 in general and the major priorities of G20 India in particular. Commentably, India is striving for food security, energy security, health security, environmental security, economic security, and political security for herself and for other countries. A judicious application of India's core strength in information technology is commendable too. a forward-looking approach on the utilization of blockchain technology, particularly Web3, digital finance, and transition to digitized asset-backed security tokens from the traditional market system is becoming a more relevant topic. India intends to create a more inclusive and equitable world. During this period, we are witnessing more and more instances of weaponization of dollar by the United States and its natural allies. Consequently, we are witnessing the consideration and initiation of de-dollarization in international trade by BRICS bloc, Saudi Arabia, and others like ASEAN countries to reduce their reliance on the US dollars. India is one of the emerging economies actively participating in the creation of a new world order, which will impact global financial governance system. This transition to a more democratic and representative world order is one priority of India's G20 presidency, as our ambassador has highlighted earlier. Based on the 17 SDGs and 169 targets of UNGA, the government of Nagaland launched the Nagaland SDG Vision 2030, Leaving No One Behind, on 17 August 2021. In addition, the district SDG localization and integration manual was launched. Our ambassador pointed out the green side of the state. I would like to also highlight the red side of the state in order for us to achieve the SDG Vision 2030. In SDG performance, Nagaland was ranked 19th in India with a score of 61, and among Northeast in its 5th position. Kohima, the capital of this state, is the top performing district, and Kifuri at the last position. Of all the SDGs, promoting gender equality, empowering women and girls are among the most significant goals. Although each tribe, community in Nagaland has different gender relations, two common areas, that is decision-making process in public sphere and the law of property inheritance need to be critically examined, as this concerns roughly half of the Nagaland population and therefore also half of its potential. A gradual conditional modification in the customary law of property inheritance, particularly in towns and cities, could be a good start. In realizing short, medium, and long-term goals of gender equality in Nagaland, the selection of appropriate development approach is a necessity. Nagaland is an agricultural state with about 60% of its population engaging in agriculture and allied activities. Yet, Nagaland has no sustainable food security and thus relies on the supply chain of other states. About 18.88% of the state population are in PPL category. In connection to this, skill development and job creation through agricultural and allied sectors to eradicate poverty by 2030 are planned and are among the top priorities of Nagaland government. Relatedly, Nagaland is looking for external aid projects, PPP, and loans, among others, to achieve the poverty alleviation goal. In connection to clean water and sanitation, in cities like Dimapur, we do not have good water governance and proper sanitation. Digital education is now an integral part of our education system, and this can be a tool for quality education, which is one of the priorities of this G20. Quality education is one significant priority of Nagaland SDG Vision 2030. Not the old education system, but a proper and a complete implementation of NEP 2020 in both rural and urban Nagaland would help achieve this goal. Beginning last year, July 2022, institutions such as St. Joseph University have started implementing this new ambitious educational policy. G20 summit, B20 summit in Nagaland may bear no remarkable outcome unless the government of India and Naga stakeholders resolve the protected Naga political issue. Experiences have taught us that a large-scale scientific exploration and exploitation of resources for economic security of Nagaland is challenging, largely because of the unresolved political issue. It is not sustainable for small states like Nagaland to be governed by one de jure government and 10 de facto governments in the land of festivals where much of her territory remains under the Armed Forces Special Power Act jurisdiction. A successful implementation of Act East policy is a necessity for India to be among the 3 largest economies, with US and China. In addition, this will help India achieve some of its G20 priorities. However, India's ambitious Act East policy will remain Look East policy unless issues like Naga political issue is politically resolved. In a sense, the seriousness and importance of resolving Naga issue cannot and should not be undermined by any stakeholders if Nagaland is serious of its SDG Vision 2030, leaving no one behind. To conclude, we have a lot of works to do. Nagaland needs more statesmen in the decision-making process. Furthermore, educational institutions need to produce enough employable workforce to meet the demands of the contemporary market and services. Thank you.
Sir, let me take the first chance. My name is Mr. Benjong. I teach here in political science. Since I heard you mention about Act East, my question is Indo-Pacific the ultimate destiny of India's Act East policy? That's my first question. My second question is, I would say India's Act East policy is to a huge extent undermined by China. And I would also mention China's Belt and Road Initiative and the Maritime Silk Route, because India and China has been seen engaging in Indian Ocean. They're also seen engaging in Myanmar for different purpose, Asian countries and all that. So my question is, has India taken any crucial steps to counter China's Belt and Road Initiative? Thank you, sir.
Good evening, respected sir. My name is Kevlin Yangami, and I'm from the Science. So, as you have clearly mentioned so well, how the world is now facing a lot of transformation and development, but together with various negative impacts. So, my question is, in order to secure a future for ourselves, as a responsible youth and a student, how do we continue to engage with G20 in order to make the world a better place?
Sir, first of all, thank you very much for the talk. We learn a lot. And in the talk, you have highlighted very clearly the G20's India's priorities. And my question is, how do such beautiful priorities can be put into practice in the context of Nagaland?
Let me start with the last two, because they're in a sense connected. How do we continue our engagement with G20, and what does it mean to Nagaland? And I think essentially what we have seen in the way the G20 process advanced was that a restricted group of countries or societies were deciding the future of humanity and the rest of the world. But that was unsustainable. And so if you bring that down to a more granular level, it was necessary to have a broader participation so that more countries would be part of the policy-making process, and therefore you would have the voice of more people heard. This is what, is the democratization of the process. In many ways, this democratization also helps in understanding the deeper problems that are there, which could be in specific parts of the world or in specific countries or in specific states of countries. And therefore, the more you hear, the more you engage, the better equipped you are to deal with the problems and to convert these challenges into opportunities. And I think that's the way we will have to go ahead. So the G20 process, as we look at its continuation, the end is not just with the G20, just as the G7 was not the solution to the world's problems. So today the G20 has an extension program, and we, for instance, have invited 8 other countries and 2 international institutions, along with other regional institutions, to participate in the G20 presidency of India in 2023. So more participative. It also has to be much more inclusive. If we don't bring in the voices of people, and this is where, what does it mean for Nagaland? At the end of the day, we share the same world. We should have the same aspirations. And if we are not heard, then the aspirations begin to diverge. And when these divergences take place in our aspirations, if the policy is not responsive sufficiently, you will find that the anxieties in society will also grow. And therefore, we need to be much more listening to things. I was very happy to hear about, the SDG progress of Nagaland, which is doing very well. But we as an SDG, in terms of our overall SDGs, we have done well on certain fronts, but there's still so much more to be done. Therefore, for a developing country like India, it is important never to give up the struggle to do even better. When I was talking about when we share our ethos and we bank on our civilization, it is important to realize that the civilization is not the future. The civilization is only a stepping stone of values and principles and experiences that you can use for a much brighter future. And the brighter future will be one in which you will have more technology, more data, you will have many of the associated benefits as well as the challenges that come with it. So I think in that process, the voice of Nagaland has to be heard much more actively, as it is, so that it becomes part of the national process, and the national process then becomes part of the regional and the global process. I hope that's in a broad sense the way we deal with how to look at G20 and its steps ahead, and also what it would mean for Nagaland. Now, the first question, which is very specific on 2 separate issues about the Act East and the Indo-Pacific, and the second being on China and its role and its BRI. Now, I was actually very fortunate because I was working in the ministry when Act East was formally launched, when we moved from Act East, from Look East to Act East. And it was a very deliberate step because for us, action on the ground, and you will notice that even in the G20 process, there is a lot of emphasis that we have placed on the action that we do on the ground. And what Act East tried to do was exactly that. How we look at an extended neighborhood. The old concept was those that are bordering you contiguously in a geographical sense are neighbors. But as you grow economically, as you grow in terms of your connections with the rest of the world, you have an idea and a concept of an extended neighborhood. And therefore, ASEAN and beyond became part of our extended neighborhood. And therefore, what we saw was we engaged with the ASEAN in terms of a comprehensive economic partnership agreement. We engaged with prominent countries in East Asia, namely Japan and Korea, on comprehensive economic partnership agreements. We extended that to the Pacific, to Australia and New Zealand, where we negotiated such agreements. And we looked at the Pacific, where the Pacific island states, many of whom have old connections with India, for instance, in Fiji, and we extended that so that we would have a viable connection towards the East. But then Act East was not an end in itself. We were also engaged in concrete work in trying to link political and economic, but also social and cultural linkages. So for instance, the projects that we have in the building of dams in Cambodia and Laos. For instance, the projects that we have in reviving the old temples of Angkor Wat, or in the connections that we have with the civilization in Indonesia and Bali, or reviving some of those old links that we had with Southeast Asia, are part of this process. And Act East then found a mirror in our West policy. So for very long, our frontiers were basically looking only at Afghanistan and Pakistan and Iran. Today, we have a very vibrant partnership with the Gulf and the Arab world, which has become, with whom we've had long tradition. So Act East found its reflection and its mirror in our policy towards our extended neighborhood in the West, in the Gulf region and the Arab countries. We've had very old connections with the eastern coast of Africa. And that's where we now see that there are new connections coming up, not only in terms of the lines of credit and the projects that we try to implement. There are many refinements that we need to do in our development partnership as well. But the process is that the changes that happened with the rise of China brought about a new reality, because the reform and opening up process of China brought about a more prosperous China, a more assertive China that was keen to play a role in regional and now also in global affairs. For India, China has been a neighbor that we've dealt with. We have a relationship which is based, on the one hand, on cooperation and collaboration, but on the other hand, it is also one of competition. And we've even had conflict. We've had a war with China in the past. We've had skirmishes in the border in the not so recent, in the more recent times as well. So our relationship with China will continue to be a complex one in which there will be several layers. We are aware of China. We're also aware of ourselves. We are aware that we are an old country. We've lived for 5,000 odd years. We will be here for the next 5,000. We have a great commitment to our people. And it's important that the rest of the world, including China, understand that. China's BRI project that you mentioned is something that has certain inherent flaws, because the BRI was based on the extension of China's interests in the neighborhood or its extended neighborhood across the world, for building connections and access for Chinese development process. And therefore, the BRI engaged not only in infrastructure building, but also in building infrastructure that was not necessarily productive, that was often not viable or feasible or did not provide the economic returns. And so consequently, what you saw was that BRI led to a number of countries becoming debtor countries, or for running into default on the debts that they had taken from the Chinese, and therefore losing the sovereignty on their economic decision, sometimes even the sovereignty of some of the areas of their own sovereign country. And therefore, BRI had serious issues within itself. We had another very serious issue with the BRI, and it's important to recognize and mention that, is that the BRI built up something called a CPEC, which is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which went through parts of territory that we believe is ours in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. And we found it rather rude on the part of any country not to have consulted us when they were doing projects in that area. So we have sovereignty issues about some of the BRI projects. We think the BRI is a project that will not succeed in the days to come. And there is increasing concern over the BRI projects. In fact, it has led to political, not just economic, but also political issues in many of the countries that China participated in the BRI with. We don't need to respond to BRI. I think this is China's autonomous decision to follow whatever approach it does on foreign policy. We should follow a foreign policy which is based on the way we view the world, on the way we view our relations with neighbors and other countries in the world, and how